December 11, 1990, 7:43 a.m. The air outside Federal Plaza was electric with camera flashes and the metallic click of shutters firing in rapid succession. John Gotti stood at the top of the courthouse steps, hands cuffed behind him, completely surrounded. 20 FBI agents formed a perimeter around him, each one wearing a bulletproof vest, each one expecting him to hide his face like every other mob boss in history. But Gotti didn't hide. Special Agent Bruce Moe gripped Gotti's arm, trying to move him forward, trying to get him inside before the media circus got worse. But Gotti planted his feet, turned toward the cameras, and did something that made every federal agent freeze. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a guilty smile, the confident, radiant smile of a man walking a red carpet. Then Gotti adjusted his $3,000 silk tie with his shoulder, even with his hands cuffed he was performing, and called out to the reporters, "Don't worry about me, worry about your ratings when I'm not around." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even some agents cracked smiles. News cameras zoomed in tight on his face, and in that moment, with the entire law enforcement apparatus of the United States government trying to make him look small, John Gotti transformed his arrest into the opening act of the greatest show he'd ever put on. What the FBI didn't know, what they wouldn't understand until it was almost too late, was that John Gotti had spent 5 years turning media attention into a weapon more powerful than any gun. And he was about to use that weapon to beat them in court, again. Before we get into what happened, hit that like button right now. And if you want to see how one man weaponized fame itself to beat the FBI, subscribe and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. To understand what happened on those courthouse steps, you need to understand the impossible position the FBI was in that morning. You need to understand the revolution that had been brewing in organized crime, and you need to understand just how different John Gotti was from every mob boss who came before him. By December of 1990, John Gotti had been running the Gambino crime family, the most powerful mafia family in America, for 5 years. He controlled construction rackets. He controlled union corruption. He controlled gambling, loan sharking, and extortion across New York City. And he'd done it all while becoming more famous than most movie stars. That fame was a problem, but not for Gotti, for the FBI. The federal government had built something nobody else in law enforcement had managed, the RICO statute, Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, a legal weapon designed to destroy the Mafia. The Southern District of New York, the FBI's Gambino squad, wiretaps, surveillance, undercover operations, all of it aimed at organized crime. And they'd used it successfully against almost every major boss in the country, except John Gotti. Gotti operated like he was untouchable. He didn't hide in the shadows like traditional bosses. He didn't avoid cameras. He didn't dress like a criminal. When other mob bosses were wearing tracksuits and hiding in social clubs, Gotti was wearing $5,000 Italian suits and dining at Manhattan's most expensive restaurants. He held court in public. He tipped $100 bills where reporters could see. He made himself the most visible mob boss in American history. And every time the FBI tried to arrest him, he turned it into a publicity stunt. In 1987, they brought him to trial on racketeering charges. Solid case, multiple witnesses, mountains of evidence. The jury looked at John Gotti in his expensive suits, looking like a successful businessman, and they acquitted him, every single count. In 1990, they tried again. Assault charges, conspiracy, more evidence, more witnesses, same result, not guilty. The tabloids started calling him the Teflon Don because charges wouldn't stick, the Dapper Don because he dressed better than the judges. And the more famous he became, the harder it was to convict him. Jurors would later admit, we couldn't believe someone who looked that successful could be a criminal. The message was clear. John Gotti had figured out something that changed the game forever.
In the age of television and 24-hour news, if you controlled your image, if you made the public love you, you could beat any case the government brought. You could make yourself prosecution-proof through fame alone. That's what the FBI was up against on December 11, 1990, as they arrested Gotti for the third time. They had better evidence than ever before. Wiretaps inside his social club, testimony from made men, RICO charges that carried life in prison. On paper, this case was unbeatable. But Gotti wasn't worried about paper. He was worried about perception, because he'd learned that in America, perception is more powerful than evidence. Image is more powerful than truth. And if you can make yourself into a folk hero, no jury will convict you, no matter what you've done. As FBI agents escorted him down those courthouse steps that morning, Gotti wasn't thinking about the charges. He was thinking about the cameras, the performance, the show. Because for John Gotti, even an arrest was an opportunity. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. December 16, 1985, 5:26 p.m. Midtown Manhattan was packed with Christmas shoppers, the sidewalks crowded with people carrying bags from Macy's and Bloomingdale's, their breath visible in the cold December air. Outside Sparks Steakhouse, one of the city's most expensive restaurants, 4 men stood in a tight cluster. They wore identical tan trench coats and Russian fur hats, the kind that made them look like they were dressed for a winter in Moscow, not a New York evening. Nobody paid them any attention. In Manhattan, you learn not to stare. Inside Sparks, white tablecloths glowed under soft lighting. Christmas decorations sparkled in the windows. Outside, rush-hour traffic inched past, cabs honking, buses hissing to stops, the normal chaos of the city preparing for the holidays. The 4 men stood perfectly still, hands in their pockets, eyes fixed at the corner where 46th Street met 3rd Avenue. 5:30 p.m. A black Lincoln Town car pulled up to the curb directly in front of the restaurant. The passenger door opened first. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, stepped onto the sidewalk. He was 70 years old, wearing a long cashmere coat over a conservative business suit. He looked like a banker, which was exactly the image he cultivated. Behind him, his underboss, Tommy Bellotti, emerged from the driver's side, closing the door with a heavy thunk.
They took 3 steps toward the restaurant entrance. The 4 men in trench coats pulled their weapons in perfect synchronization, semi-automatic pistols that had been warm against their bodies, now cold in the December air. 12 shots shattered the Christmas shopping soundtrack. 6 bullets hit Castellano, spinning him sideways before he crumpled to the pavement, his cashmere coat spreading beneath him like a blanket. 6 hit Bellotti, who was dead before his body hit the ground beside the car. Christmas shoppers screamed. People dropped their packages and ran. Car brakes squealed as drivers realized what they'd just witnessed. The 4 shooters didn't run, walked to a waiting car and disappeared into Manhattan traffic before the first 911 call connected. Half a block away, John Gotti sat in the passenger seat of a Lincoln identical to Castellano's. He watched the hit he'd orchestrated with the cold calculation of a man who'd just changed the course of organized crime history. Castellano represented everything Gotti despised about the modern mafia: cautious, businesslike, invisible. Castellano wore conservative suits and avoided any location where cameras might catch him. He ran the Gambino family like a Fortune 500 company: quiet, efficient, boring. Safe. Gotti hated safe. Within 6 hours, word spread through the 5 families. Paul Castellano was dead, and John Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino family, the most powerful crime organization in America. Gotti was 45 years old, a career criminal who'd spent 2 decades as an enforcer, a hijacker, a killer. He wasn't supposed to be boss. The old-timers knew it. He wasn't diplomatic enough, wasn't subtle, wasn't careful. He was too visible, too loud, too hungry for attention. Traditional mafia wisdom was clear. When you kill a boss, you disappear for months. You let the heat die down. You stay invisible, stay quiet, let your lawyers do the talking. That's how you survive. That's how the Mafia had lasted 100 years. John Gotti ignored all of it. Instead of hiding, he held court every afternoon at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, sitting at a table visible through the front window, waving to people walking past. Instead of dressing down, he upgraded. $1,500 suits became $2,000 Brioni suits that made him look like a Wall Street executive. Instead of avoiding public places, he took his crew to Manhattan's most expensive restaurants, tipped waiters $100 bills, made sure everyone saw him. FBI surveillance teams couldn't believe their luck. Subject appears to be deliberately drawing attention to himself, one agent wrote in a memo. Recommend increased surveillance as subject seems to want to be caught. But something strange started happening. When Gotti walked into restaurants, other diners applauded. When he strolled through Little Italy, people stopped him to shake his hand, ask for photos. Business owners treated him like a celebrity. The neighborhood saw him as a success story, the kid from the Howard Beach projects who'd made it to the top. March 1986. Federal prosecutor Diane Giacalone indicted Gotti on RICO charges, racketeering, conspiracy, assault. It was a solid case with multiple witnesses and documentary evidence. Every expert said Gotti was finished. The Teflon was about to crack. But Gotti saw something nobody else did. Not a threat, an opportunity. His lawyer, Bruce Cutler, came to him with a standard question. Boss, you want me to ask for a closed courtroom, keep the press out, make it harder for them to build a narrative? Gotti looked at him like he'd suggested surrender. Are you kidding? I want every camera in New York there, every reporter, every news crew, every tabloid photographer. He leaned forward, eyes bright with something that looked like excitement. Bruce, this trial, this is going to be the best publicity we ever had. August 1986. United States versus John Gotti, Federal Courthouse, Manhattan. Prosecutor Diane Giacalone sat at the government's table surrounded by file boxes and evidence binders. 7 defendants, dozens of witnesses, mountains of surveillance photos and financial records. This should have been straightforward, a RICO case so solid that conviction was inevitable. The first day, Gotti arrived wearing a $2,000 double-breasted navy suit with a crisp white shirt and gold cufflinks that caught the courtroom lights. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back with precision, not a single strand out of place. He looked like he was heading to a corporate board meeting, not facing racketeering charges. Photographers swarmed the courthouse steps, and Gotti gave them exactly what they wanted: confidence, style, the appearance of success. That night, the local news didn't show a mobster on trial. They showed what looked like a successful businessman being persecuted by an overzealous government. The New York Post headline screamed, "Dapper Don fights feds." The Daily News ran a full-page photo with a caption that asked the question Giacalone dreaded: is this the face of a criminal? In her opening statement, Giacalone laid out the evidence methodically. John Gotti is a career criminal who has murdered, extorted, and terrorized this city for decades. But when she glanced at the jury, several of them were smiling, not at her presentation, but at Gotti. He was charming them without saying a word, just by sitting there looking confident and impeccably dressed. The pattern emerged over weeks. Gotti never testified, Bruce Cutler did all the talking, but every day became a fashion show. Monday, charcoal gray suit with burgundy tie. Tuesday, navy pinstripe with white pocket square. Wednesday, black suit with silver tie. The press started covering his wardrobe like he was attending the Oscars, not a federal trial. Giacalone's witnesses crumbled on the stand. Some recanted their testimony. Others seemed intimidated, though jury tampering was suspected but never proven. But some witnesses simply appeared reluctant to testify against someone the public had fallen in love with. Cutler turned the courtroom into theater. He didn't just defend Gotti, he portrayed him as a successful Italian-American businessman being persecuted by a government uncomfortable with ethnic success. He highlighted Gotti's charitable work, his sponsorship of youth sports, his support for struggling families in Queens. The media ate it up.
News coverage increasingly framed the trial as David versus Goliath, the scrappy kid from Queens against the massive federal government. The fact that Gotti was actually a brutal mob boss who'd killed his way to power got buried under the narrative. The jury loved him. They smiled when he entered the courtroom. They paid attention to his reactions during testimony. One female juror would later admit she thought he was handsome and didn't seem capable of the things they were accusing him of. March 13, 1987. After 11 weeks of testimony and 6 days of deliberation, the jury foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Not guilty, on all counts, every single charge. Giacolone sat frozen, devastated. FBI agents in the gallery looked at each other in disbelief. They'd had everything: witnesses, evidence, surveillance. How had they lost? Outside the courthouse, Gotti's arrival created a scene like a rock concert. Hundreds of supporters cheered. Cameras swarmed from every angle. Gotti stopped, waved, shook hands like a politician after an election victory. A reporter shouted, "How does it feel to win?" Gotti flashed his signature smile. In America, the truth always wins. That night, in his apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti poured drinks for Sammy Gravano and explained what had just happened. "Sam, you see what happened today? The feds had everything: witnesses, evidence, the whole package, and we still won. You know why?" Sammy shook his head. "Because the jury loved me. They saw me on TV every night. They read about me in the papers, and they decided I was one of the good guys. They couldn't convict someone they liked that much." Gotti stood up, energized by his own realization. The old bosses had it all wrong. They thought you gotta hide, stay invisible, never let anyone see your face. But this is 1987. This is the television age. You can't hide from cameras anymore. They're everywhere. So instead of hiding from them, you use them. You make people love you. And if they love you, they won't convict you. It's that simple. Sammy felt a chill run down his spine. "Boss, that ain't the way it's supposed to work. We're supposed to stay out of the papers, away from cameras. That's what Cosa Nostra means, this thing of ours. It's supposed to be secret, invisible." Gotti's smile widened. "The old way is dead, San. I just invented a new way, and it's gonna make me untouchable."
Over the next 2 years, John Gotti didn't just accept media attention, he orchestrated it like a maestro conducting a symphony. He studied how cameras worked, which angles made him look most commanding, what colors photographed best under courthouse lights. He was building a weapon more powerful than any gun the Gambino family had ever used. The wardrobe escalated. $2,000 suits became $3,000 suits, then $5,000 handmade Brioni suits flown directly from Italy. He commissioned them in bold patterns, pinstripes, chalk stripes, subtle checks that photographed dramatically. He coordinated silk ties with pocket squares down to the exact shade. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine that reflected camera flashes. Every detail was calculated for maximum visual impact. Twice a week, Gotti visited a barber in Little Italy, not for a haircut, for a full grooming session. Hair styled with imported pomade, nails manicured, even skin treatments. He looked like a movie star preparing for a premiere, not a mobster running a criminal empire. The tabloids loved it. Dapper Don became his permanent nickname, appearing in headlines more often than his actual name. Gotti figured out the media's patterns like he'd once figured out armored car routes. He knew when photographers stationed themselves outside certain restaurants. He timed his arrivals at Sparks Steakhouse. Yes, the same location where he'd had Castellano killed, Gotti had a dark sense of irony, for exactly 7 p.m. when news crews gathered evening footage. His tipping became legendary, but only when reporters were watching. $100 to a coat check girl, $200 to a waiter, $500 to a maitre d'. Word spread through the service industry and into the press. John Gotti takes care of people. The fact that the money came from extortion, loan sharking, and murder was conveniently forgotten in the feel-good narrative. Every 4th of July, Gotti threw a massive block party in Ozone Park, Queens. Tables of food, fireworks for the kids, a DJ, the full carnival atmosphere. Local news covered it as "Businessman Gives Back to Community." At Thanksgiving, he handed out turkeys to struggling families, cameras rolling. Christmas meant toy drives, Valentine's Day, flowers to neighborhood widows. Every holiday became a photo opportunity reinforcing the same message: John Gotti cares. Despite the expensive suits, he maintained his thick Queen's accent, his working-class mannerisms, his rough edges. He didn't try to sound educated or refined. He sounded exactly like what he'd been, a kid from Howard Beach who'd made it to the top. Relatable, authentic, real. FBI agents watched this media campaign with mounting fury. They had surveillance photos of Gotti ordering hits, wiretaps of him discussing murders, witnesses who testified to his brutality. But none of it penetrated the public image. People saw the dapper Don, not the killer. November 1988. FBI arrested Gotti again. Assault, racketeering, parole violations. When he arrived at the courthouse, he wore a $4,000 suit and waved to supporters like he was arriving at a movie premiere. The 1989 trial became pure theater. Bruce Cutler delivered passionate speeches about the persecution of Italian Americans, portraying Gotti as a martyr victimized by government overreach. The jury loved every minute. February 9, 1990. Not guilty on all counts. Again. The jury foreman later told reporters, "We just couldn't believe someone who dresses that well and seems that charming could be capable of such terrible things. The government must have the wrong guy." The tabloids coined a new nickname, the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck. Gotti embraced it, using the phrase himself in interviews. "They call me the Teflon Don, but I just call myself an innocent man." By 1990, John Gotti was the most famous mobster in America. Time magazine ran a cover story. Local news aired fawning profiles. He'd transcended crime and become pure celebrity. The weapon he'd created, his carefully constructed public image, seemed absolutely invincible. But in the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, where Gotti held his most private meetings, the FBI had installed a listening device, and every day they recorded everything. Gotti discussing crimes, planning murders, and most damning of all, bragging about his media strategy, explaining exactly how he manipulated the press, controlled his image, played the public like instruments. The very weapon that protected him was about to provide the evidence for his destruction. Early 1990, John Gotti was untouchable. 2 federal trials, 2 complete acquittals. The FBI had thrown their best prosecutors, their strongest evidence, their most credible witnesses at him, and lost both times. Gotti had beaten the system, and his confidence had transformed into something far more dangerous: absolute hubris. He started taking risks that would have terrified the old bosses. Every afternoon, he held court at the Ravenite Social Club, visible through the front windows, accessible to anyone walking past. When Sammy Gravano suggested being more careful, pulling back on the public appearances, Gotti dismissed him with a wave. "Let 'em watch, Sam. What are they gonna do? They already tried to get me twice and failed. I'm bulletproof." Above the Ravenite, in a small apartment Gotti used for private meetings, he spoke more freely than any mob boss in American history. He didn't know about the FBI bug hidden in the ceiling. He thought his media popularity had made him genuinely invulnerable, that fame itself was armor. So he talked, and talked, and talked. The tapes captured everything. Gotti didn't just discuss crimes, he bragged about his media manipulation with the pride of an artist discussing his masterpiece. "You see how I got them eating out of my hand?" he told his crew one afternoon. "The press thinks I'm a folk hero. The public loves me. These stupid feds bring me to trial and the jury takes one look at me in my suit and thinks he can't be a criminal, he's too classy." But worse than the boasting were the specific admissions. The Castellano hit. "We clipped Paul right outside Sparks. Beautiful hit. Clean execution." Loan sharking operations. "We're pulling in 200 grand a week just from the shy business. Easy money." Extortion schemes. "Every construction site in Manhattan pays us. They don't pay, they don't build. Simple." He described money laundering operations in intricate detail, explaining the mechanisms like he was teaching a business school class. The tapes also captured Gotti criticizing his own crew.
He called them stupid, complained about their performance, mocked their abilities, including Sammy Gravano. "Sam is useful, but he ain't the brightest," Gotti said on one recording. This would matter later when Sammy heard those words. Even as he made these damaging statements in private, his public image continued to soar. Magazine covers, television profiles, documentary interviews conducted carefully through intermediaries. The Dapper Don had transcended being a person. He'd become a brand, a cultural phenomenon. Some in the family started to worry. Sammy noticed Gotti speaking too openly, trusting his perceived immunity too much. Other captains whispered that the constant attention was dangerous, that the old way of invisibility existed for a reason. But nobody could tell the boss he was wrong, not when he'd beaten the feds twice. Leaders of the other four families, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, watched Gotti's media circus with growing alarm. This wasn't how the Mafia was supposed to operate. The heat he was generating could burn everyone. But Gotti didn't care about their concerns or their complaints. He'd proven his method worked. They were just old men clinging to outdated traditions. September 1990. After years of surveillance and hundreds of hours of recordings, the FBI made a decision. They would use Gotti's own weapon against him. U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney began building a different kind of prosecution, not just proving crimes, but exposing the man behind the carefully constructed image. The strategy was elegant. Use Gotti's own recorded words about media manipulation to prove his public persona was a calculated lie. Show the jury that the charming neighborhood guy was actually a cold-blooded killer who'd been playing them all along. Turn his greatest weapon, his image, into the evidence that would destroy him. December 11, 1990, 6 a.m., FBI agents gathered for the raid, errant warrants in hand. They had 5 years of surveillance, hundreds of hours of damning recordings, and a prosecution strategy Gotti had never faced before. As agents prepared to move in, the special agent in charge said something that would prove prophetic. "This time, we're not just arresting John Gotti, we're arresting the Dapper Don, and we're going to show that character is just as fake as any other crime he's committed." December 11, 1990, 6:47 a.m. FBI agents surrounded the Ravenite Social Club and Gotti's home in Howard Beach, Queens. Simultaneous raids, coordinated down to the second to prevent anyone from warning him. This was the biggest mob bust in years, and the Bureau wanted maximum impact. Agents pounded on Gotti's front door with the side of their fists, the aggressive knock that announces federal authority. When Gotti answered, they noticed something remarkable. Even at 6:47 in the morning, his hair was perfect. He'd already showered, already groomed himself with the same precision he'd bring to a court appearance. They placed him under arrest. Gotti didn't resist, didn't complain. He asked one question: "Can I change into a suit?"
Even in this moment, Gotti was thinking about the cameras. He knew this arrest would dominate the news. He knew there would be photographs that would run in every newspaper in New York. He needed to look right. The agents refused. They wanted him in casual clothes, wanted him to look less polished, more like the criminal he was. But Gotti had planned ahead. Under his casual jacket, he wore an expensive dress shirt. In his pocket, a silk tie. During the car ride to Federal Plaza, while agents discussed logistics over their radios, Gotti worked the tie around his neck and buttoned his shirt properly. By the time they arrived at the courthouse, he looked more put together than half the agents escorting him. 7:43 a.m., Federal Plaza. The courthouse steps were packed with every news outlet in New York. The FBI had tried to keep the timing secret, but word had leaked. Later investigation would suggest Gotti's lawyer had tipped off friendly reporters. Cameras everywhere, reporters shouting questions, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Instead of the standard perp walk, head down, jacket over face, rushed movement, Gotti stopped. Right there on the courthouse steps, surrounded by FBI agents trying to move him along, he planted his feet and turned toward the cameras. Agents tugged at his arms. He resisted just enough to stay in frame, to get his moment. Gotti looked directly into the lenses and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the grimace of a man facing life in prison, but the confident, radiant smile of someone who'd played this game before and won. It was a message broadcast to every television in the city. I'm not worried. This is just another performance. A reporter's voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Gotti, are you worried about these charges?" Gotti's response was loud enough for every microphone to catch, perfectly timed for maximum effect. "Only about my dry cleaning bill. These suits don't clean themselves." The crowd, ordinary New Yorkers who'd come to watch the spectacle, actually applauded. FBI agents looked at each other in disbelief. Their target, facing murder charges and life in prison, had just received applause on the courthouse steps like a performer taking a bow. Inside, the arraignment followed routine procedures. Charges read, bail discussed, conditions debated. But even in the formal courtroom setting, Gotti performed. He sat ramrod straight, projected confidence, nodded encouragingly at supporters in the gallery. Every gesture calculated, every expression controlled. Prosecutors argued strenuously that Gotti was a flight risk and should be held without bail. The judge reviewed his record. 2 previous federal trials, 2 acquittals, no history of fleeing jurisdiction. Over the prosecution's loud objections, bail was set at $1 million. Gotti's people posted it within hours. 3 p.m. When Gotti emerged from the courthouse after making bail, the media circus had grown even larger. This time he was free to speak, and he stopped for a brief statement that would run on every evening newscast. Once again, the government is wasting taxpayer money trying to prosecute an innocent businessman. And once again, we will prove in court that these charges are baseless harassment. That night, every news program in New York led with the story, but the framing varied wildly. Some outlets, mob boss arrested on murder charges. Others, Dapper Don defiant in face of federal persecution. The New York Post headline screamed, "Gotti gets last laugh," above a photo of him smiling on the courthouse steps. The Daily News, Teflon Don strikes again. In FBI offices across the city, agents watched the coverage with mounting frustration. They just arrested one of the most dangerous criminals in America, and the media was making him look like a persecuted celebrity. "He's turning his arrest into a publicity stunt," one agent said, throwing his newspaper onto a desk. His supervisor, Special Agent Bruce Mao, picked up the paper and studied Gotti's smiling face. "That's exactly why we're going to convict him this time. We're going to use that against him." That evening, at a restaurant in Queens, Gotti held court with his crew like nothing had happened. "Third time's the charm," he joked, raising a glass of wine. "The feds are 0 for 2 against me. This time won't be any different." His men laughed, toasted, celebrated. Sammy Gravano sat at the end of the table, quiet. He'd seen the indictment, read the charges. This time felt different. This time, the feds seemed to have a plan that went beyond traditional prosecution. But when he tried to voice his concerns, Gotti waved him off. "Relax, Sam, we got this. We always do." What Gotti didn't know, what nobody outside the FBI knew yet, was that this arrest was fundamentally different from the previous 2. This time, prosecutors possessed something they'd never had before: hundreds of hours of Gotti's own voice, recorded in his apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, bragging about crimes, discussing murders in detail, and most damning of all, explaining exactly how he manipulated the media to stay free. The weapon he'd so carefully constructed was about to be turned against him, and this time, all the expensive suits in Italy couldn't save him. January 1991. Discovery. Gotti's defense team received the prosecution's evidence in waves, boxes and boxes of materials delivered to their office, financial records, surveillance photographs, witness statements, standard procedure for a federal case. Bruce Cutler and his associates began the tedious work of cataloging everything, looking for weaknesses, building their defense strategy. Then Cutler found the transcripts. Buried deep in the discovery materials, hundreds of pages of typed conversations recorded in the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. As he read, the blood drained from his face. The FBI had bugged Gotti's private meeting space. For months they'd recorded everything.
conversations about crimes, detailed discussions of murders, complete explanations of the family organizational structure, the hierarchy, who reported to whom, and most damning of all, Gotti's own voice explaining how he manipulated the media, describing how his entire public image was a carefully constructed lie designed to fool juries. Cutler called Gotti immediately. "Boss, they have you on tape, talking about Castellano, talking about other hits, talking about—" He paused, searching for words. "Talking about the media thing." Long silence on the phone. Then Gotti's voice, stripped of its usual confidence. "How bad?" "Really bad." The tapes contained direct admissions. "We clipped Paul, beautiful hit, right outside Sparks." Detailed discussions of ongoing crimes, extortion, loan sharking, money laundering, with dollar amounts and victim names. Complete explanations of the family organizational structure, the hierarchy, who reported to whom, and, devastatingly, Gotti's own voice describing his media strategy. "These idiots in the press, they eat it up. I dress nice, tip big, smile for cameras, and they think I'm Robin Hood." Worse still, the tapes captured Gotti mocking the public for believing his image. "These people are stupid. They see an expensive suit and they forget I'm a killer. They think good clothes mean good person. It's pathetic how easy they are to manipulate." Worse still, the tapes captured Gotti criticizing Sammy Gravano, calling him stupid, questioning his capabilities, complaining about his performance. Sammy hadn't heard these recordings yet, but when he did, everything would change. March 1991. Cutler filed motions to suppress the tapes, illegal wiretaps, violations of attorney-client privilege, improper surveillance procedures. The judge rejected every argument. The tapes were coming in as evidence. Moreover, Cutler himself was mentioned on several recordings, making him a potential witness. He was disqualified as Gotti's attorney. Albert Krieger took over the defense. He was skilled, experienced, but he lacked Cutler's theatrical flair. More critically, he inherited a case that was already fatally compromised. The media weapon that worked so effectively in the previous trials wouldn't work this time. Prosecutors had Gotti's own voice explaining exactly how he built that weapon. Summer 1991. Prosecutors approached Sammy Gravano with an offer. Testify against Gotti, receive a reduced sentence. Sammy refused immediately. He'd been loyal to Gotti for years. They were friends, brothers. They'd built the Gambino family together. He wasn't a rat. He would never be a rat.
Then prosecutors played him the tapes. Gotti's voice filled the interrogation room. "Sammy's useful, but he ain't the brightest. I got to explain everything twice." Another tape. "I question whether Sammy's got what it takes for this level." Another. "Sometimes I think Sammy's holding us back." Sammy listened in silence. His face remained expressionless, but his hands, resting on the table, slowly curled into fists. Something inside him fractured. The bond of loyalty that had survived murders, prison time, federal pressure. Gotti's words on those tapes broke what the FBI never could. For weeks, Sammy deliberated. He was facing life in prison. His boss had been mocking him behind his back. But most importantly, Sammy realized something that filled him with rage. Gotti's ego, his insatiable need for media attention, his refusal to follow the old rules of invisibility, that's what got them all caught. If Gotti had stayed quiet, stayed low profile, they'd all still be free. Instead, Gotti's addiction to fame had destroyed everyone around him. November 8, 1991. Sammy the Bull Gravano, underboss of the Gambino crime family, John Gotti's closest friend and confidant for over a decade, agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He would testify against Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. The ultimate betrayal, the death sentence for Gotti's defense. When news leaked that Gravano was cooperating, it dominated every headline. Gotti's underboss flips. This was unprecedented in Mafia history. Underbosses didn't cooperate. They went to prison, served their time, maintained omerta, the code of silence, no matter what. But Gravano was different. In later interviews, Gravano explained his decision with brutal honesty. John's ego was going to get us all killed.
He cared more about being famous than being smart. He couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop performing for cameras. The old bosses stayed alive by staying quiet, by being invisible. John got us all caught because he needed to see himself on TV every night. Prosecutors now possessed everything: recordings of Gotti admitting to crimes, and Sammy Gravano, who'd been present for those crimes, who'd helped commit them, ready to testify about all of it in excruciating detail. The prosecution that had failed twice before now had an absolutely unbeatable case. When Gotti learned about Sammy's betrayal, witnesses said he went completely silent for a full minute, his face turning red, veins visible in his neck. Then, that fucking rat, after everything I did for him. But privately, alone in his cell, Gotti knew the truth. It was over. With Sammy testifying and the tapes playing, no amount of media manipulation could save him now. News coverage began to shift dramatically. Reporters who'd written sympathetic profiles of the Dapper Don now published confessional pieces about being manipulated. Features appeared with titles like "How John Gotti Fooled the Press" and "The Media's Complicity in Creating a Monster." The weapon Gotti had so carefully constructed was being dismantled in public, turned against him piece by piece. January 21st, 1992. Opening day of United States versus John Gotti, Federal Courthouse, Manhattan. But this trial felt fundamentally different from the previous two. The crowds outside were smaller, more subdued. Media coverage carried a skeptical edge that hadn't been there before. And Gotti himself seemed changed, less confident, more withdrawn. He wore another expensive suit, but it looked like costume now rather than armor. He knew what was coming. U.S. Attorney Andrew Maloney stood before the jury. His opening statement was devastating precisely because it was so simple. For years, John Gotti convinced this city that he was a successful businessman, a neighborhood benefactor, a man being persecuted by an overreaching government. I'm going to prove to you that John Gotti is none of those things. I'm going to use his own words, recorded in his own voice, to show you who he really is. And I'm going to bring you his closest friend, who will tell you about crimes they committed together. Gotti's attorney, Albert Krieger, faced an impossible task. How do you defend a client when prosecutors have him on tape admitting to crimes? Krieger's strategy was predictable because nothing else was available. Attack Gravano's credibility, question FBI methods, argue the tapes were taken out of context. But everyone in that courtroom understood it was a losing battle. Week 1. Prosecutors began playing the audio recordings. The jury heard Gotti's voice, not the charming public persona from television, but the real John Gotti. On the Castellano hit, "We clipped Paul, it was beautiful. Right outside Sparks, Christmas shopping all around. Nobody saw nothing." On extortion, "Every contractor in Manhattan pays us or they don't work, simple as that." On loan sharking, "The Shy business is pulling 200 grand a week, easy money." Most damaging were the recordings where Gotti explained his media strategy. "The press are idiots. They see an expensive suit and they forget I'm a killer." Another tape, "I tip $100, newspapers write stories about what a great guy I am. They never ask where the money comes from." Another, "These stupid people love the Dapper Don. They have no idea who I really am." Unlike the previous trials where jurors had smiled at Gotti, charmed by his appearance and confidence, this jury looked disturbed. They were hearing proof that they, the public, people just like them, had been systematically manipulated. They were hearing Gotti mock the very people who defended him. The charm offensive couldn't work when you were on tape laughing about how easily people fell for it. Week 3, March 2nd, 1992. Sammy the Bull Gravano, now in witness protection, walked into the courtroom wearing a simple, inexpensive suit. Prosecutors had specifically instructed him not to dress like Gotti. Gotti stared at him with pure, undiluted hatred. Sammy kept his eyes forward, never making contact. The prosecutor's first question was direct. "Mr. Gravano, how many murders were you involved in?" 19. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Judge Glasser gavelled for silence. And how many of those were with John Gotti? Approximately 10 to 12 I was directly with him on. Gravano described the Sparks Steakhouse hit in excruciating detail. Who planned it? Gotti. Who executed it? Gravano was there watching the 4 shooters. Why they did it? Castellano was too cautious. Gotti wanted absolute power. How it was done? Coordinated attack. Gotti watching from a car half a block away. The jury took notes furiously, their faces showing shock and fascination. Gravano explained the Gambino family's complete structure, hierarchy, rules, money flow, decision-making process. He detailed Gotti's role as boss, his control of every major operation, his personal involvement in murders and strategic decisions. This wasn't hearsay or speculation. This was an insider explaining the organization from top to bottom. He described years of friendship with Gotti, making money together, killing together, building the family together. The depth of their relationship made his testimony more credible. Why would he lie about someone he was so close to? And it explained his betrayal. Hearing those tapes of Gotti mocking him had shattered a bond prosecutors never could have broken. Krieger cross-examined him for hours, attacking from every angle. You're a killer. Yes. You're admitting to 19 murders. Yes. The government is giving you a deal for testifying. Yes. So you have every reason to lie to save yourself. Gravano's response was devastating. I don't need to lie. I was there for everything. I saw it all. And I'm sick of covering for a guy who thought he was too famous to go to prison.